The rumble of trucks outside the window of the old apartment building, mixed with the hum of electrical appliances and the occasional muffled voice from behind the thin walls. Gary Mason, a typical New Yorker, a 22-year-old college student, was sitting in the kitchen in front of an old landline phone, from which only crackling and static had been coming for a week. This phone was one of the few artifacts of the last century left in the house, and Gary didn't understand why he was even trying to repair it. But the guy desperately didn't want to leave things unfinished. So he decided to take a chance and call a specialist. He had barely left a request when the doorbell rang. It was almost 9 o'clock at night, and Gary, who had expected his request to be ignored until morning, froze in amazement.
He peered through the peephole. Standing outside the door was a short, slightly overweight man in a faded blue work jacket. The stranger's face was covered in sweat, as if he had run a marathon to get to Gary's apartment.
"Good evening," said the man when the door opened a crack. "Have you called a specialist? Do you have a problem with your phone?" Yes, Gary replied, slightly surprised at how quickly someone responded to his request. "Where are you from?" "A service center?" Exactly. The Urban Connections Service Center. "You can call me John." The man smiled. His gaze darted inside the apartment. "May I come in?" Gary, a little hesitant, nevertheless invited him in. The specialist immediately went to the table where the broken phone stood, pulled tools out of his breast pocket, and began to carefully inspect the old device. Gary stood awkwardly by, watching John, who was already sorting something out inside the phone case. After a few minutes, John spoke.
"It seems to have broken down due to overheating of the contacts," he explained without looking up. "It's a common occurrence in this area, and the area, is not easy."
"In what sense?" Gary frowned, not understanding what this conversation was about. John seemed to hesitate a little, then exhaled, as if deciding on something, and looked at Gary. His gaze was so serious that the guy involuntarily tensed up. "You see, I used to work at the city switchboard, which handles all the landlines in the area," John began casually, continuing to solder and twist something on the phone. "All conversations, all signals, pass through one point. And at night, strange things happen there." "Strange?" Gary asked, raising his eyebrows. "Which ones?" John continued to fiddle with the wires, but his voice became more muffled.
"Sometimes, when the main number of calls subsides, there are voices on the line." He looked up at Gary. "I'm not talking about interference or signal failures. These voices, you can hear them clearly. They whisper, speak different languages, and discuss events that no one could possibly know. And they're always afraid that someone will eavesdrop."
"Are you saying that these are some kind of hackers?" Gary suggested, trying to hide his laughter. "Or maybe your switchboard picks up some radio frequencies?" "I mean, they're vampires," John blurted out, his face tense and his eyes nervous. "Not the ones that are shown in the movies. I'm talking about creatures that feed not on blood, but on information. They live among us and control everything they hear and see, and they're afraid that someone will be able to reveal their secrets." Gary involuntarily stepped back, not knowing how to react. Perhaps this specialist was just an eccentric with an excessively violent imagination. Or even worse, slightly touched. But John looked too serious. Too much. "Look," Gary began cautiously, "I'm not sure what you're getting at. If you could just fix the phone." John sighed heavily and went back to work, his hands busy with the wires again, but the tension in the air remained. "I'm sorry, it's just they've become more active lately. When I was working on the switchboard, I thought I was crazy.
But this is not the case. These voices are real. I do not know how to explain it. The man swallowed, his face contorted. They know a lot about us and can do anything with signals. If they find out that I've told anyone...
Hey, relax. Gary tried to smile to ease the tension. This is New York. Every second person here thinks that crocodiles live in the sewers and street rats can rob you of your scholarship. But vampires? I think it's not that scary.
John didn't answer. I just picked up my phone, turned it on, and the familiar beep sounded. The man nodded, handed the device to Gary, and began to collect the tools.
Thanks, Gary muttered, still slightly shocked by the strange conversation.
Try not to use your phone at night anymore, John said as they reached the door. Don't call, don't listen, especially if you hear voices. He paused for a second, as if about to add something else, but then he just smiled, said a short goodbye, and went out into the hallway. Gary stood at the door for a long time, leaning against the jamb and trying to make sense of everything he had heard. Paranoia is one thing, but this... 10 minutes later, when Gary was about to go to bed, there was a scream. He jumped up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound came from the entrance. A high-pitched, pain-filled scream. He jumped out onto the stairwell and saw a neighbor from the 5th floor, Mrs. Phelps, standing over a body sprawled on the floor. It was John. His face was pale, distorted in death agony. The blood slowly spread across the floor, forming a crimson stain.
My God! What happened?
Gary croaked, running up to the body. Mrs. Phelps just sobbed, pointing at him with a trembling finger.
It's you, she whispered. I saw you take him out. Did you kill him?
What? No, I didn't do anything. Gary stepped back in horror, his hands trembling involuntarily. I swear, I just... A few minutes later, the police burst into the entrance. Gary didn't even try to resist when he was pinned down and handcuffed. Everything was blurring before his eyes, as if he was in a black and white movie.
He tried to explain something, but his words were drowned out by voices, noise, and flashing lights.
Later, sitting in the deserted interrogation room, Gary could only stare at his hands, which were covered with small bloodstains. I could see John's distorted face, his last words about voices, and the horror that shone in his eyes. The office door creaked softly, and 2 people entered. A tall, sturdy man with a cold smile and a petite, serious mulatto girl. Gary recognized them instantly from the photos on the news.
Well, Mr. Mason, the man smiled, leaning back in the chair opposite. Shall we talk? My name is Detective Daniel Rivera, and this is my partner, Layla Blake. We're here to understand how you got involved in the death of a technical specialist.
Gary was silent.
Well, Mr. Mason, Daniel drawled, crossing his arms over his chest and leaning closer to the guy, his gaze intense and searching. Can we start by telling you in detail how your phone broke down and who was the specialist who came to fix it?
Gary swallowed nervously. His voice trembled. It was an ordinary foreman from the service. I think his name was John. He said the problem was with the contacts. I fixed it pretty quickly. That's right. His name was John Frolofsky. And what happened next? Layla's voice was gentle, her tone soothing even when she remained completely focused. Did he finish and you just walked him out? Yes, I walked him to the door. But... Gary hesitated, glancing at the detectives as if he wasn't sure if he should continue. He started telling me some strange things. I didn't pay attention at first. I thought he was just talking to fill the silence.
Strange things? Daniel asked, his eyebrows slightly raised.
Yes, he said, that I used to work on the switchboard. Gary glanced nervously at the wall, and they say they hear voices there at night. It's like someone's talking. He stopped, looking uncertainly at Layla, as if checking her reaction. He said they were vampire voices. What they say to each other, they know everything about everyone, but they are afraid that someone will overhear them. Daniel snorted, shaking his head. Vampires? Seriously? He looked at Layla, clearly trying not to smile. And you decided that the master was just a little crazy? Yes, I thought it was some kind of nonsense. Gary nodded quickly. I wasn't even really listening. I was just nodding and that was it. He talked about some kind of information control, that they were monitoring people. He said that you shouldn't listen to phone lines at night and... Gary stopped talking, his fingers curled into a fist. And then when he left, I heard a scream. I ran out and he was already lying there covered in blood. And you swear that you were not involved in his death? Daniel straightened up, looking down at the guy. You know, Mrs. Phelps said that you were standing over his body. Yes, she found him first, but I didn't do anything. I just wanted to help and ran out of the apartment. Gary shook his head frantically, his eyes filled with fear. I didn't kill him. I swear. I didn't even know what happened to him. Layla silently watched Daniel and the guy. Her gaze was focused, but there was some thoughtfulness in it. When Gary stopped talking, she nodded gently. Very well, Mr. Mason. We understand you, she said calmly. Let's stop for now. We will record your testimony, and then we will continue. Escort, take him away. Two officers took Gary by the arms and led him out of the interrogation room. Daniel lingered, watching the guy disappear through the door, and only when they were alone did he sigh heavily. Leia, did you hear that? Vampires. He shook his head and grinned. Who would even think of such a thing? The guy is obviously hiding something, trying to dodge the truth. The body of this specialist is covered with his blood all over the entrance. There were drag marks on the stairs, but no prints, no weapons. And the guy was the only one who was around. And then there was Miss Phelps. She saw them both. I'm sure he knows something and is just making nonsense to appear innocent. Maybe, Layla mused, sitting down on the edge of the table. But you know, there are some strange details in this story. Why did he mention the switchboard? Have you ever encountered such a thing? And anyway, what vampire voice was he talking about? What if it has something to do with the place where this John used to work? Daniel frowned. His eyes narrowed. Are you serious? Layla, we will not get carried away with mysticism and other nonsense. Let's focus on the evidence, on the facts. What they were discussing about voices is complete nonsense. Maybe it was just a figure of speech to confuse the investigation? I remember one incident. Layla continued quietly, ignoring his skepticism. There was a similar situation in the mid-90s. At that time, calls were recorded in several states that allegedly caused aggression and hallucinations in people. These calls allegedly came from switchboards located in strange, abandoned places, and no one could explain what it was. Back then, it was said that people who received such calls were programmed to kill. And you think that our good fellow John, a former telephone repairman, got under the influence of some kind of program and decided to talk about it on all corners? Daniel didn't hide his sarcasm. His voice was full of disbelief. I think it's worth checking the switchboard he was talking about, Layla replied, looking him straight in the eye. If the guy's right, and something's really going on at this station, we have to find out. Leia, We're investigating a murder, not playing ghost hunting, Daniel snapped. But then, looking at her stubborn face, he gave up and raised his hands. Okay, fine. Let's look at this damn switchboard. But if there is nothing there, there are no stories about voices in the report, okay? We're looking for real evidence, not fairy tales.
Layla nodded and stood up, her gaze warming.
Of course, Detective. No mysticism, just real work. They left the interrogation room and went to the car. The sun was already setting, and gloomy shadows from buildings crept onto the streets, creating strange patterns on the asphalt.
The switchboard was on the edge of the neighborhood, an abandoned building, shabby and empty.
Let's see what the local vampires do at night, Daniel muttered as they approached the door. The rickety old switchboard building stood on the outskirts of the district, lost among warehouses and dilapidated industrial buildings. It seemed that the entire area had long been dropped from the list of vital sites in New York. Even the air here was musty and heavy, as if the concrete and bricks had accumulated decades of dust and neglect. Daniel and Layla stood at the rusty gate, from which the paint was falling off, and silently looked at the peeling walls. Well, hello, good old industrial America, Daniel muttered, looking around. It's just like the cover of an album by some gothic metal band. I wouldn't be surprised if there are sacrifices in the basement here. You promised to do without mysticism, Layla grinned, hitching her bag on her shoulder. Let's just focus on the case. Agree? Daniel sighed, shrugging his shoulders.
Okay.
He pushed open the creaking gate, and he and Layla went inside. Inside, the building was just as gloomy and uncomfortable. A spacious hall dimly lit by flashing lights, and several corridors branching off in different directions. It looks like this place hasn't seen renovation for a long time. Cables stretched across the ceiling, hanging down like old vines in a forest. But despite all the abandonment, the muffled voices of the staff could be heard somewhere in the depths. The switchboard continued to work. The detectives headed toward a small office, on the door of which there was a faded sign with the inscription, Administrator. They knocked, and a moment later the door was opened by a tall man in his 50s, with thick gray hair and narrow, attentive eyes. How can I help you? His voice was tired, as if the man was already used to endless explanations and questions. Detective Daniel Rivera. Daniel introduced himself, showing his ID and pointing at his partner. This is Layla Blake. We're investigating the murder of your former colleague, John Dillon. We would like to ask you a few questions. The man nodded, frowning slightly, but let them inside. I'm Steve Carr, the head of this station. Sit down. John. I've known him for many years. To be honest, it all came as a real shock to me. I found out about his death just today. He rubbed his eyes, closing them wearily. What exactly do you want to understand? We're interested to know if John was concerned about anything before he died. Layla began, trying to speak softly so as not to cause rejection. Maybe he mentioned something unusual in his work, or did he tell you about the strange calls? Steve lowered his eyes. A shadow of something like regret crossed his face. John has always been a bit nervous, he said carefully. After he left his main position and switched to repairing phones, he became more withdrawn. He said something about voices on the line. It's like someone... Steve trailed off, as if he didn't want to say too much. Nonsense, in general. I always told him it was just old wires and radio interference. But John, he believed those voices were real. Real? Daniel asked, barely able to keep the irony out of his voice. Are you saying that he really thought he was hearing something supernatural?
No, he thought they were people. Steve shrugged slightly. His gaze remained distant. Some kind of personalities who use lines to communicate with each other. He said they knew something about us, about our lives. They were whispering something about him, saying his name. It all started a few months ago. And then he just left.
Layla and Daniel exchanged a quick glance. Gone? So you quit? Layla asked.
No, he just disappeared. Steve sighed. He's been missing for a week, and when he returned, he was no longer the same. He said that he heard them and that there are too many of them. I offered him a vacation, but he refused.
And you haven't tried to find out what happened to him? Daniel narrowed his eyes. You are his supervisor. You should have... Listen. Steve interrupted, his voice turning hard. I didn't want to pry into other people's business. John was a great employee, and his behavior changed dramatically. Something happened, but he refused to talk. I do not know what exactly. He paused, rubbed his temples, and exhaled wearily. And now he's gone, and I have no idea who might have attacked him. John was quiet and didn't bother anyone.
Daniel and Layla exchanged glances again. Something in Steve's tone suggested that he knew more than he was letting on. But before they could ask any more questions, the phone rang. Steve tensed and took a quick glance at his desk.
I'm sorry, I have to take this, he muttered, getting up. Please wait here. He went out into the hallway and closed the door behind him. Layla wanted to speak, but Daniel stopped her with a gesture and, putting his finger to his lips, stepped to the door, carefully opening it. Steve was standing by an old wall phone. Layla tensed, standing next to him. Daniel made a sign. Listen. And they cautiously leaned forward to catch at least a few words. Steve picked up the phone and slowly brought it to his ear. The silence lasted for long seconds. And then he said in a low, quiet voice, "They know." Just 2 words. But there was so much desperation and fear in them that the hairs on Layla's arms stood on end. Steve listened for a few more seconds and then slowly hung up the phone, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and returned to the office, trying not to look at the detectives. Sorry. It was an inside line, he muttered, sitting back down. So what are we talking about? Daniel stared at him intently, tense and focused.
John said it was the voices. He began slowly. That they know everything about people, and that there are too many of them. What exactly did you hear on the phone, Steve?
The man's face paled, and he nervously wiped his palms on his trousers.
I don't understand what you're talking about,
he replied hurriedly, avoiding their gazes.
No voices. It's just interference, radio signals. Was it a normal call? Layla asked, her voice turning icy.
Steve froze. His gaze met Layla's for a moment, and something like realization flashed in his eyes. Then he stood up abruptly. You have to leave, he muttered, avoiding their eyes. Please.
I can't help you. I have to work.
Daniel wanted to object, but Layla stopped him.
Okay, Mr. Carr,
she said slowly, studying him with her eyes.
We'll leave. But if you remember anything, please contact us.
They left the office and headed for the exit, but Daniel abruptly turned around and looked at Layla.
What the hell was that?
Do they know? It sounded like he was communicating with someone who was keeping him under control. Layla nodded, her face serious. I do not know, but this place, it's kind of wrong. I think we should continue, unofficially. Do you want us to stay here tonight? Daniel snorted, shaking his head. Leia, this goes beyond everything. Her voice was firm.
But something tells me we're almost to the bottom of this.
They fell silent, looking at the empty, gloomy building and the shadows in his windows, seemed darker than they should be. Towards morning, Layla was sitting on her bed, surrounded by old books and printouts, her eyes darting over the lines with almost painful attentiveness. The dim light of the lamp picked out the pages from the darkness, covered with strange symbols and ancient drawings. She could barely keep from rubbing her eyes with fatigue. Exploring vampire mythology took her into the darkest corners of stories she had never even heard of before. Vampires, the very creatures that have been mankind's nightmare for centuries. But the ones she was studying now had nothing to do with the classic image of Dracula or Hollywood monsters with cloaks and fangs. No, images of much darker and more incomprehensible creatures unfolded before her. Layla's fingers carefully turned the page, and a name popped up in front of her eyes. Neun Tote. An ancient German legend described this vampire as one of the most cruel and vicious creatures. Translated, his name meant Killer of the Nine. It was believed that Neun Tote is a harbinger of death and always takes exactly 9 lives with it. According to legend, he did not leave any visible wounds on the bodies of the victims. They all seemed to be simply sucked out from the inside and left in unnatural poses, with their mouths open in silent screaming. Hear his whisper, "Know that the end is near," read the old phrase at the bottom of the page. Layla shivered as she read the description of how Neun Tote penetrates people's minds. He could summon to himself anyone who listened to the silence of the night for too long, and once he got in touch with a person, he never let go of him again. Voices whispering on the switchboard at night. Could it be the sounds of Neun Tote? She didn't even know how to approach this issue from a logical point of view. She put down the book and picked up the next volume. There was a strange image inside. Elongated, almost skeletal figures dressed in antique robes. The text read, "Werewolves from the Czech Republic." Although werewolf is traditionally associated with werewolves, in this context, the word was used to refer to a certain type of vampire who could change their shape, becoming ghostly, invisible creatures. They sucked the energy out of people, causing them to gradually go crazy. These creatures, according to legends, left no visible traces. They fed on emotions, absorbed fear, pain, and even the memories of their victims. And when they were sated, their victims remained only empty shells, alive, but completely immobilized and devoid of personality. It was said that you could recognize their presence by the faint smell of ozone and a slight ringing in your ears, as if someone was whispering to you right at the edge of perception. But it wasn't just European legends that were teeming with such creepy creatures. Layla flipped through the pages, and a new description appeared in front of her. Ghoul, or Vi, is the Russian version of a vampire whose appearance was different from all the others. Vi was a creature of the night and secret knowledge. He didn't drink blood. Instead, he took over people's thoughts, subjugating them to his will. It was believed that if you saw his eyes, which were always covered with eyelids, he could get right into your mind and make you do things that you would never dare to do. With a single glance, he could provoke incredible outbursts of brutality and murder, and no one even suspected that the real reason was not the man, but the monster hiding behind his eyes. Layla closed the book wearily and ran her hand over her face. Her brain refused to take it seriously, but something inside screamed, "Don't just leave it like that." Maybe John wasn't crazy.
Maybe there really was something more to it than the old master's delusions and fatigue, legends mixed with reality.
All this, of course, could be a game of the mind, but some kind of elusive connection caused Layla to have a gloomy premonition.
She looked at the old landline phone on the bedside table again and sighed.
Don't you dare ring in the middle of the night, she muttered, turning off the lamp and settling herself on the pillows. I don't want you to start telling me something yourself. She closed her eyes and slowly drifted off to sleep, feeling a thick, heavy slumber envelop her body. The darkness began to swirl her consciousness, pulling her into strange images and visions. Layla found herself in the middle of an empty, starry sky. Huge, glowing dots pulsed around her, forming invisible constellations. She floated slowly in the air, as if her body were devoid of weight, and her feet were touching a soft, invisible canvas.
Ahead, against the background of endless darkness, something was moving.
A pale, almost transparent figure, a bald man, tall and thin, moved through this starry sky, his outlines blurred as if made of smoke. He was slowly approaching, and the closer he got, the more clearly Layla could hear his whisper. Don't come any closer. The voice was quiet, but every sound echoed clearly in her head.
Layla tried to take a step back, but her body wouldn't obey. The whispers grew louder.
Don't come any closer. Don't come any closer. The words were spinning in her mind as if someone was screwing them into her skull with a drill. The pale face of the lipless monster froze in front of her. Huge, bottomless black eyes staring straight into her soul. The voice rose to a high, pitched scream echoing through the void. Layla jerked and sat up in bed, gasping for air. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Sweat covered her forehead, and her hands were shaking from the horror she had experienced. The dream was so real that it seemed as if the figure of an evil creature was still hanging in front of her eyes.
She looked around, trying to figure out where she was. And then she saw
an old landline phone on the bedside table. Its handset dangled from the cable, swinging slightly from side to side. Layla froze, unable to look away. The phone was just hanging. Someone took it off. Or did she knock it down with her hand in her sleep?
She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and carefully picked up the phone, returning it to its place. The phone rang as usual, and Layla froze for a moment. What if it wasn't all a dream?
She shook her head, pushing the nonsense away.
It's just a dream, she repeated to herself, her voice sounding hoarse and hollow. A dream. An ordinary dream.
The morning light streamed softly through the window, filling Layla's room with a delicate golden glow. The bathroom was enveloped in a light steam haze while Layla stood under the warm jets of the shower, feeling the water wash away the remnants of an anxious night. Her long hair was stuck to her back, glistening with droplets, and her skin was slightly flushed from the hot water. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to relax, and ran her hands over her wet shoulders, massaging the tense muscles. Her fingers slid down her neck, gently brushing away strands of hair. The water touched every curve of her body, enveloped her, giving her a feeling of comfort and peace that she had not felt for so long. My thoughts returned to yesterday, to my conversation with Steve and the strange dream that still left a taste of fear. Who was this bald man? And why were his words so strongly imprinted in her mind? Layla opened her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to get the night terrors out of her head. It's just a nightmare, she repeated to herself. It's just a mind game. She turned off the water and reached for a soft terry towel that lay on the shelf next to it. The cloth gently touched the skin, wiping away the last drops of water. Layla slowly dried herself, feeling a chill run through her body from contact with the air, and put on a silk robe. Her hands lingered on the belt for a moment, pulling it a little tighter. The smooth, delicate silk touched her body, and she sighed, feeling the thin fabric envelop her figure, hiding the drops of water running down her neck and collarbones from her hair. When Layla returned to the bedroom, her attention was attracted by an open book that remained lying on the bed. The pages moved slightly, as if in a gentle breeze, even though the windows were closed. She frowned, feeling a cold lump forming in her stomach. "It's a fucking nightmare," she muttered to herself, wiping her hair. "It's just a dream, Layla. It's just a dream." Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp, loud ringing of the phone. Layla froze. The sound seemed to fill the entire apartment, vibrating in the air. Her heart started pounding, and without breathing, she looked back at the phone. An old, heavy stationary phone stood on the bedside table. Its receiver, which she had carefully hung up the night before, was now back in place. She almost expected to see her fall again, as if from someone's invisible hand. Layla took a deep breath and slowly stepped to the phone, feeling the fabric of her robe stick to her wet skin. With every step, her legs felt heavy, but she walked over anyway, picked up the phone with a trembling hand and brought it to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice sounded a little quieter than usual, but she tried to speak firmly. "Layla, this is Daniel," a familiar voice said. "I'm sorry to bother you, but you need to know this. Gary Mason, our suspect, he's dead. He hanged himself in his cell at night." Layla froze, unable to believe what she had heard. "How did he hang himself? What is it?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "But he was under constant surveillance. How could he—" She stammered, unable to find the words. "I don't understand it myself." Daniel sighed heavily. "But the strangest thing is that he left a suicide note. He wrote that he had killed John. He took all the blame on himself. He said that this way he would stop them." "Layla, do you know what he could be talking about?" Layla shook her head, even though Daniel couldn't see her. Her fingers tightened around the receiver.
"I do not know. What else was in the note?"
There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Daniel continued.
He wrote that he was forced to do it. He heard voices telling him what to do and how to do it. He wrote that he heard them in silence, on the phone.
The words seemed to pierce her mind, making her involuntarily recall a nightmare.
"Phone lines,"
she whispered, feeling a chill run down her spine. "What else?"
"At the end, he mentioned—"
Daniel hesitated again, but his voice was full of tension.
He wrote that the vampire's voice ordered him to kill himself.
This is crazy, Leia, but I think he believed it, already being in the cell. Maybe psychosis. Stress, after all. Layla took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts.
"We need to get back to the switchboard," she said firmly. "I want to see the place where John worked. Maybe we missed something."
Are you sure? Daniel was clearly doubtful, but there was no longer any objection in his voice. Okay, we'll go there tonight. But, Layla, be careful. I will. She exhaled, her voice a little softer. Thanks, Danny. She carefully put down the receiver, looking at the phone again, which seemed to be staring back at her like a living being. His horn faded, and an oppressive silence hung in the room. Layla sighed and turned away, trying to calm her excitement. This case with Gary was incredibly strange, but she felt that the answer was close. All they need to do is reach the end and see what lies behind this maze of fear and death. Meanwhile, in the police station, dim light fell on the gray cell bars. Gary Mason's body was hanging lifelessly from a tourniquet of government blankets tied to the bars. The officer checking the cameras sighed heavily and,
turning away, quickly recorded the incident in a log while his colleagues were preparing to take the body away.
A few hours earlier, sitting on a cold concrete bench, Gary had been biting his nails convulsively and listening to the ringing silence. He knew it was his last night. He tried to fall asleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same bald, pale man standing in the distance and staring at him intently. Gary finally fell into a fitful sleep. It all started with darkness. He stood in the void, shrouded in a thick, viscous fog. There was a salty taste of fear on his lips, and his legs could barely move, as if they were immersed in a viscous slush. A figure flashed by in the distance. At first, Gary thought it was just another nightmare, but something about her was eerily real. "Your time has come," came a whisper, soft as a breeze, but clearly audible. Gary strained to find out where the voice was coming from, but the figure was slowly approaching him. The bald, pale man moved smoothly, as if he wasn't touching the ground, but gliding through the air. His eyes were huge, black, and empty. Her pale skin glowed with an unnatural, almost moonlight glow. Gary wanted to scream, but his throat caught when he saw the creature's face. The thin lips slowly spread into a crooked smile, and the whisper grew louder, enveloping Gary like a deadly veil.
"Now it's your time to die."
The creature leaned forward, its lips paused a few centimeters from Gary's ear, and the moment he realized he couldn't move, everything went dark in his eyes. He screamed, but the sound faded into the vast void. The officer standing by the camera flinched and dropped his pen when a piercing, pain-filled scream rang out. He turned and saw Gary's body jerk violently. His eyes widened and his face contorted in silent horror. After another moment, everything went quiet.